Good afternoon, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces in the participants bar. So good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having myself and Dr. Worsham here. So today we'll be talking about implicit bias and holistic review as these sort of operational things that we can wrap our head around as folks in GME. Because when we say diversity and inclusion, they're often these very abstract and large looming things. So we want to try to focus in on some tangible things that we can wrap our head around related to our functionality. So the term implicit bias, I'm sure many of you have heard it before. The UC Learning Center has implicit bias training modules. It's something that is brought up a lot in everything from college admissions to law enforcement to literally how people walk up and down the street. It's something that's very pervasive in our lives, right? And in I guess what we'd label as my functional area, right, of the university, how implicit bias works. If I could frame it very generally, it is how these milestones and these benchmarks, if you will, that we believe are objective become very subjective. And I'll get into what that means right now with some examples from the field. So just to ground us in some definitions and some concepts, right? I mean, implicit biases are a natural product of the way that we process the world around us. A lot of the information, especially nowadays, we are inundated with media and imagery and stimuli all around us. A lot of what we learn about the world is very passive, right? And yet we can reference it very instinctively. An analogy I always like to make is, when I'm talking to my mom and she says, "How's your friend from high school?" I can say if that person has a family and children, where they live, where they work, if they've gone on vacation, and I haven't spoken to that person in 20 years, right? But social media and all these other things around us, I'm passively downloading all this information and I can reference it at the tip of a hat, right? Despite the fact that it's maybe not always at the front of my mind, right? And when we do those things with the world around us, it reflects how we understand the world, and that can be both positive and negative, right? Even things that on the outside and on the surface we believe to be positive can reflect negative biases and blind spots. So here are some examples from the field of medicine as of late that have really reflected this these implicit biases that show that things that we believe to be positive can reflect larger negative structural occurrences. So this particular article cites a recent podcast from JAMA, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, that discussed the topic of structural racism. Here is an excerpt from the podcast description. "No physician is racist, so how can there be structural racism in healthcare?" And then this is an excerpt from the article describing the podcast. So one of the speakers in the podcast didn't understand the concept meaning structural racism, suggests that racism was made illegal in the 1960s and that the discussion of racism should focus or shift to that of socioeconomic status, right? So again, thinking about the implicit bias here in this particular case, we have someone who is attempting to frame this topic of racism as very objective, right? In this particular example, trying to cite the law in this country as the evidence that racism does or does not exist, right? But the backlash that's sort of cited here in this article talks about the colleagues in our field who are citing miles and miles of empirical literature that shows that racism at a structural level really does still exist in terms of how patients are served, how physicians are recruited and retained in the field, and so on and so forth. In a sense, right, it's almost proving the person's point that, since it no longer exists on a policy level, racism still exists at a more subconscious and differently positioned level than it did before. And the podcast, I don't know if it says on the excerpt here, but the podcast has since been taken down by JAMA, and there have been efforts to create restitution in the medical community over the last couple months. If you've been in tune to that sort of thing. Another example over the past year came from the Journal of the American Heart Association, where an author submitted what was called a white paper to the journal, talking about holistic review and affirmative action, which Dr. Worsham will get into a little bit later. So the quotes here are from the article itself in the journal, speaking about affirmative action and diversity, that long-term academic solutions should not be sacrificed for short-term optics. Another quote from the article is that there exists no empirical evidence by accepted standards for causal inference to support the mantra that diversity saves lives. So again, in this case, not only did this person write this, but it also went through some level of review, since it was a white paper, right? So the questions are, not only does this author have a particular bias that diversity only means one thing and excellence in being a physician only means one thing, right? But so did all the others who read this review before it came out. Who read this white paper, I'm sorry. So again, we have a person who is trying to propose an objective and black and white view of the particular term, right? In this case, diversity and affirmative action and excellence. And to address the question in the chat, that actually is a very good point. The journal has actually shifted their guidelines and has because there was a lot of backlash about whether or not this was a white paper even at all. And again, the backlash, similar to the podcast I just referenced, really did talk about how there is a lot of literature out there that again is contrary to the points proven in this paper, yet the author simply chose to cherry pick that which supported his claims. Literature which many accused of being outdated and debunked through other literature. So I give these examples, right, to frame this phrase, that's just the way it is, right? Something that we hear all the time in all aspects of our life, but particularly in the work that we do in higher education and academic medicine, we really do see a lot of rote benchmarks, right? That you have to take standardized tests, you have to take a certain amount of years of education, obtain your degrees. So we believe that there is this singular path to success that is the same for everyone, right? But many of these successes are still based on subjective decisions and perceptions. So again, especially when we talk about things like admissions, hiring, promotion, who gets a good review, who is deemed as useful, who is deemed as a problem. All of these things really are influenced by our subjective opinions that can really not only have these effects on our livelihood and our professional development, but really do scale up to how we are able to serve patients. If we are not able to find diverse physicians to serve our diverse communities, or if we are not able to find people with diverse and innovative sets of skills and ways of thinking, then that is not just doing a disservice to some abstract concept of knowledge, right? But it's also doing a disservice to the people that our mission as an institution purports us to serve. So some ways of where to begin that I can suggest to you all. The first thing I will really couch this in is that there is no magic wand to establish or eliminate biases. One of my favorite grad school cliches is that the mind is a muscle. There's not going to be a magic training or a magic checklist that will eliminate biases. These are things that constantly have to be worked on. The first thing I can really offer to you all is to keep aware of the national and international trends in your field. The simplest way I can word this is to read all your emails. I know that's a challenge for many of us, but it's a goal that even I strive to do in my position, whether that's through listservs or media in the field of health sciences, even just skimming things, filtering them and reading them when you have free time. So you understand what's happening in the field. What are the major research subjects? Who are the major players? What is being discussed? And it really normalizes things beyond our bubble here at UCI to understand who's out there, what are they talking about. So when an idea comes up about a diverse topic, it's not as novel to you and doesn't seem as fleeting. It really helps us to understand what else is going on out there. Another piece of advice to mitigate our implicit biases, particularly as it relates to diversity, I really want to emphasize that it's important for us to normalize and promote diverse stories as an active and normal part of what we do, not just tokenizing these narratives and these diverse people in our sphere to times of turmoil or commemorative months and weeks. So we should not just be celebrating Asian Americans in May when it's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, or we should not just be celebrating our LGBTQ population when it's Pride Month, right? In doing that, it sort of pigeonholes these folks into a particular time and place. And yes, those days are important, but there still is time throughout the year that we can emphasize that as well. Think about our families, right? We love our families all the time, right? Yet we still have holidays and Christmas and Thanksgiving and our anniversaries and birthdays where, yes, it's special and it's a particular time, but we still should be able to find ways to express our gratitude, if you will, all the time, so that we don't just think about diversity as pigeonholed to a particular place. If I can make a negative example, right? Think about your family member who only talks to you when they need money. Do you think you have a great relationship with that person? Probably not, right? Versus the people who you talk with on a more regular basis, your relationship is probably much more sustainable in the long run. Another thing I want to emphasize is set progressive deadlines and meet them. It's particularly when we're talking about hiring and even writing and doing literature reviews and things of that nature, setting these progressive deadlines to see if you are meeting your expectations, if you have all your blind spots covered, to really stop and think about, are we accomplishing the goals that we set out to do? And when I work with students, and even, I'm susceptible to this myself, there's this cliche, I work better under pressure. I'll write a 5-page paper at midnight the day before it's due. But when you say that, and when anyone says that, what you really mean is you work better when there's stakes and accountability, because that's what it means to work last minute, that if it's not done, then you will have some detrimental thing happen to you. So I emphasize at this time, right, that diversity, equity, and inclusion, we should be held accountable to those things, because it is an imperative for us as an institution to be able to serve a diverse population. And with that said, all of our diversity goals, whether that is to recruit more of X population, or to do more outreach to X patient population, or to increase representation in leadership, or promote the use of gender inclusive language or gender inclusive facilities, all of these initiatives that we want to bolster should be tied to our professional goals. Think about your mission statement. Think about your charge as a committee on this campus, or your charge in a position of leadership. The Office of Inclusive Excellence, led by Vice Chancellor Doug Haynes on main campus, which many of you I know have interacted with, really does a good job of pointing to, this is where and why we do it. And it's a part of what we do. It's not just, as I said, something from times of turmoil or a commemorative month, but something that we do all the time. And if it's not there, then write it there. Your mission statements, your department websites, they're not the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can and should revise them based on what the current needs of your department are. So before I transition to Dr. Worsham, I also want to give a brief spotlight to one such initiative in GME that we've been working on, Dr. McCrae and I and many others, Tanya Saba, I also see on the call. Is the Residency Open House program, which is now in its 3rd year. And this year was our most successful event. It is, for those of you who are unaware, it's an annual open house for third-year medical students across the country. It's open to all students from accredited medical schools, but it is targeted, we do targeted publicity to medical schools with the highest URM populations. In 2019, we did it in person. In the last 2 years, we've done it virtually. And this agenda includes the Dean's keynote, a program director panel, and a residence panel, which I see some familiar faces from those on here. Some keynotes about DEI initiatives, how to have a great application, how to make your application more robust, and breakout rooms with program directors and residents. And this year we had the most registrants ever. We had 235, which was up about 70 from last year, 64% female, 55% underrepresented in medicine. That's going off of the definition that's been bolstered by UCSF, which includes Southeast Asians in the definition of underrepresented minorities in medicine, in addition to the other groups which are more commonly understood to be underrepresented. The most common programs of interest amongst our registrants were dermatology, anesthesiology, internal medicine, OB-GYN, and psychiatry. So this was the feedback that we got from the students this year. It was overwhelmingly positive. As you see at the top bar, before the event, about 50% said they were extremely likely to apply to residency at UCI, and that number went up to 91%. And no one is on the fence after the event. So we have 200 students who are really excited about the things that we offer and the things that they saw and heard at this open house, and they're ready to apply for residency here this upcoming year. So how we want to think about now moving forward how to capitalize on that momentum, because it's not merely enough to have diverse applicants, but we have to also, again, think about our mission in our various programs and departments, that we have to have diverse methods of analyzing the potential of our applicants. And this is a question that happens all the time, that diversity does not have to come at the cost of excellence. We still can find ways to have excellent physicians who excel academically, who excel in patient care without compromising anything that we expect out of our top level hospital and patient care. So, it really requires us to keep diversity, equity, and inclusion as the focal point, as something that is woven into everything that we do and not just thought of as reactive, right? But as something that is proactive. So that's a brief overview of, the diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to implicit bias, as it relates to, getting out there and finding diverse folks and thinking about ways to not only change who we see, but how we see them. So now I will transition to Dr. Ursula Worsham, who will give a more in-depth example of how holistic review is implemented at the undergraduate medical education level in order to recruit diverse medical students to UCI.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. So first and foremost, I think a fantastic transition to talking about the holistic admissions process based on what Dr. Hernandez shared is the importance of being intentional in our efforts. Being intentional in our efforts, meaning that if we're looking to recruit and retain through the admissions process, diversity in our efforts, that's not going to start at selection. So everything really begins with recruitment and outreach. And an important component of recruitment and outreach is ensuring that all of the appropriate stakeholders are in the room. As Dr. Hernandez mentioned, that we're being intentional in setting our goals, whether they be department goals, program goals, formulating some kind of needs assessment so that way we can ensure that our efforts are aligned with not only the institution's mission, but also the mission, once again, of our department and our programs. It's also important to define holistic admissions. It's a very popular buzzword to use, not only at the UME and GME level, but it's important that we're intentional in defining what that means to our prospective residents, prospective students, prospective staff, faculty, as well. Because if we're not articulating what we mean by holistic admissions, how can we assume that applicants will be considering that when it comes to applying to our programs? Additionally, attending things such as national conferences are important. We need to meet our prospective candidates where they are. And so some wonderful opportunities that we've taken advantage of, not only at the UME and the GME level at UC Irvine, is getting involved in some of our national conferences hosted through SNMA, the annual Medical Education Conference, LMSA, as well as ANAMS, are opportunities once again to meet candidates who are historically underrepresented in medicine, where they are, where they're congregating, engaging in thought and also consideration of our programs. And as Dr. Hernandez highlighted, the importance of hosting events such as open houses, and also potentially considering visiting elective programs as well as departmental scholarships to make it possible for a more diverse application base to consider our programs as well. So today we'll be focusing primarily on screening, interviewing, and selection. And so as part of that, we'll be talking about a specific holistic review model that could be considered that the AAMC provides, not only for UME, but also GME. The importance highlighting implicit or unconscious bias training, the importance of, once again, that intentionality of ensuring that we're annually or maybe even quarterly reviewing our policies and practices for equity when it comes to admissions and selection, ensuring that we have potentially the inclusion of rubrics at the screening process, the interview process, as well as the evaluation process. That way we can ensure that we're doing everything we can to mitigate bias, and also ensuring that we're all on the same page, looking through a singular lens that's aligned with our mission and, once again, vision and our goals for our departments or institution. Ensuring that we engage diversity champions on our campus. There are many individuals that want to provide support and help when it comes to diversifying our programs. And we also ask for consideration when it comes to the diversity tax, right? We don't want to over-engage our diversity champions consistently and not continue to grow that pool of individuals who can kind of come in and help when it comes to our diversity initiatives and needs. Host second look programming can go hand in hand with open houses. Also ensuring that we have a diverse selection committee. And then last but not least, we want to ensure that we foster a community of inclusion and support, because it's one thing to get individuals to our campuses and to our hospitals that reflect the diversity of our patients, but what are we doing to support those individuals once they are present? So let's consider all of these things once again when we think about holistic admissions. Next slide, please. So a great place to start is a definition provided by the AAMC, in which holistic review is a flexible, individualized way of assessing an applicant's capabilities, by which balanced consideration is given to experiences, attributes, competencies, and academic or scholarly metrics. And that's the EACM model that's going to be discussed today as far as a holistic review model provided by the AAMC. And the tenet here is that when we consider all of these things, we're looking for individuals at our undergraduate level and our GME level that can contribute value to our mission. So this isn't about special consideration. This is about adding value to the work that we do to ultimately impact the patients that will be served. Next slide. So when we talk about considerations for holistic admissions and or selection, once again, you will see here that implicit or unconscious bias training shows up at every single level. So it's important whether we're screening, interviewing candidates, or providing selection, that we are being mindful of the biases that we all may bring to the table, whether we are aware of them or whether we are not. And so training can ensure that, once again, everyone's on the same page when it comes to screening. Are we utilizing screening rubrics to understand, once again, what is our goal? Who do we want to recruit or retain? And how do we ensure that we're all looking at the same types of things related to the applicants that are being considered? Once again, we're going to look at the AAMC's EACM model. And then also there was consideration in the literature about potentially expanding examination score cutoffs in the screening process. As we know, the USMLE is moving towards pass-fail, so that may help that particular consideration along. But one thing that we've done at the UME level is just look more broadly at our standardized testing and what individuals were being excluded when we had testing at a particular score cutoff that maybe wasn't as inclusive as it could have been. And we've really seen a difference in who we've been able to consider. And once again, thinking more broadly about MCAT scores in particular, and that could be a potential consideration as well for the USMLE licensing examination. We'll also look at interviewing, the consideration of metric blind interviews to mitigate bias. For undergraduate medical education, our interviewees do not see MCAT scores and or GPA, so they are exclusively focusing on the interview with the applicant, what they're bringing to the table related to their experiences, their potential success for practicing as a physician and being a medical student, and also, once again, what attributes and or overall kind of passion they bring towards their interest in pursuing medicine, but specifically at the UCI School of Medicine. Also, we utilize prompts that can help interviewers as far as things that we're looking for related to context of an individual's application and or interview. But I think there's also an opportunity for us to continue to make improvements here when it comes to rubrics for the interview process. And I challenge us to do the same consideration for the GME level. And then once again, consider using diversity champions in our interviewing, as well as ensuring that our interviewers reflect the demographics of those who are being interviewed. Oftentimes that can make a huge difference in just applicants seeing themselves at various institutions if they see representation at the programs that they are considering. And then the NRMP has a wonderful resource as far as a code of conduct to ensure that we're not asking questions that we shouldn't be asking. So there's strong consideration there as far as the interviewing resource as well. And then last but not least, as part of that selection process, it's really important that we are annually, once again, reviewing our policies, procedures, and admissions practices to ensure ongoing and continual equity. So let's first look at screening. So here you'll see two different models highlighted. They're almost identical. Both are by the AAMC. The one on the left, which is the EAM model, which is experiences, attributes, and metrics, serve as a framework that guide how we review applications holistically at the undergraduate level for medical school admissions. And you can see here what I love at the core of both models is the word excellence. So as Dr. Hernandez talked about, the fact that in order to achieve diversity, we do not have to make sacrifices when it comes to excellence. I love seeing that word at the core of what the AAMC provides. On the right-hand side, you'll see that they've also created a model for holistic GME selection. Excellence is still there, but you'll see that they added a C in the acronym for competencies. And so there are some wonderful opportunities, once again, to take what we're utilizing currently at the UME level as far as considerations for applicants' holistic experience is, once again, what are they bringing to the table when it comes to their experiences, their attributes, their competencies, as well as their metrics. Next slide, please. So here, when we look at experiences based on the AAMC's model, we see here we are primarily looking at the experiences that encompass an applicant's path to get to where they are at the time that they're applying to your program. The outer ring is more reflective of the context. So the context that they're bringing to the table, which could include influences such as political events, historical events, world events, and or cultural events. So basically those things that internal to those experiences that have shaped kind of who they are, and once again, their distance traveled as an applicant to be considered for your program and or for medical school admissions. So it's important when we think about their experiences that we're taken in context from which they came, but also their experiences related to potentially healthcare, or what experiences do they have in leadership? How have they worked with diverse communities? Have they been engaged in research and or involved with professional associations and or service? So this is just two particular rings kind of on the outside of the model that we're being called to look at when we look at an application holistically. Next slide, please. When we shift to attributes, we're looking more here for an individual's overall kind of growth and development and achievement when it comes to their attributes as part of a holistic review. So what particular skills and abilities or personal qualities do they bring to the table that are highlighted in their application? That could be how they worked as part of a team, whether it be through a student organization, volunteer service, research, or a project. What integrity are they bringing to the table? Is that something that's been highlighted in their letters of recommendation? Do they have language proficiency in a second, third, or fourth language? How have they shown leadership in their application? And then once again, an opportunity to highlight any kind of cultural competence that they bring to the table through their own experiences, their own personal narratives, or through involvement with various diverse communities. So these are all things, once again, that are seen as a positive in the application that, once again, we haven't even started talking about, board scores or GPA or anything like that. We're just trying to get, once again, to the core of who this individual is, and once again, how can they add value to our institution. Next slide, please. So now we shift to competencies. When we focus on competencies, we're looking at how do the individual apply the skills that they bring to the table, and how has that been demonstrated in their application? Do we see specific and consistent, focus on a particular type of patient care, a particular population? How has their medical knowledge shown up in their application and or through their letters of recommendation? Professionalism, how has that shown up or not shown up in the application? What do they bring to the table related to their interpersonal and communication skills? Overall, these are all things that we're trying to identify. How do they think? How do they achieve results? How do they interact with others? And also, how do they self-manage? All very important things as an incoming medical student and or a future physician. Next slide, please. Here are some resources that we use at the undergraduate level as far as understanding how an individual brings core competencies for incoming medical students. So this is something that is advertised very widely on the AAMC website. So once again, we talked about at the very beginning the importance of defining holistic admissions or defining what we consider as core competencies. We have many ways in which to do that, but this is a wonderful resource for applicants to not only look in advance to see, okay, here are things that are valued when it comes to holistic admissions, either to medical school or to residency as an example. And here, how can I then, as a applicant, whether it be medical school or residency, start to engage in activities that highlight these competencies as I move forward through the steps of my journey to practicing as a physician. So here, these are 15 examples and ways that this can show up for a entering medical student. And I think that there's some potential overlap and capacity for consideration at the GME level as well. Next slide, please. And so last but not least, this is kind of the metrics ring, one that we're all very much familiar with at both the UME and GME level. So metrics is kind of that middle core towards excellence here, where we're looking at the quantitative scholarly and academic components of an individual's application, where we look at not only their academic performance or scholarly work, whether they've been involved in grants, publications, looking of course closely at their MSPEs and what those examples look like, and the things that have been highlighted positively in their application. Have they engaged in presentations, or also of course the consideration of their exam scores. Once again, I highlight there the importance of considering, at least in the interim before the exam becomes pass-fail, to consider expanding cutoffs there as part of the holistic review, as we have done with the MCAT. Next slide, please. So when it comes to interviewing, a 2015 study, actually 2014 study of the common considerations for interview by NRMP program directors highlighted that individuals being considered for interview, oftentimes they're focusing on USMLE scores, letters of recommendation, MSPEs, the personal statement, as well as the individual being a US medical graduate. So probably not a surprise to anyone on this presentation, but once again, gives us another opportunity to think about, and this is kind of what everyone's looking at, how do we make sure that we incorporate the various holistic models into our lenses related to how we look at letters of recommendation, personal statement, MSPEs, to ensure that we're not, as part of the selection process, excluding individuals that potentially could impact the diversity of our programs when looking at these items narrowly. That being said, when looking at those individuals through this survey that oftentimes are matched, the most common considerations then turn to interactions with faculty and house staff, feedback from residents, and also interpersonal skills. So ultimately, we're looking for individuals who work well as part of a team, who have great interpersonal skills, who work well with others, have made a positive impression on residents during the interview process. Then it's important that we are, once again, applying whatever necessary resources that we need to address and mitigate implicit bias, because this is where that subjection can come in if we aren't careful. Next slide, please. So additional considerations for interviewing, as I mentioned before, as part of the UME interview experience, we do have metric blind interviews. There also may be opportunities to consider that at the GME level if that isn't already happening amongst some programs. Additionally, structured interviews. This past year, due to the pandemic, we utilized the AAMC Vita resource through HireView. And so for the first time, as far as our structured interviews, we had applicants answering questions from a pool of questions rather than maybe our traditional kind of questions related to, if you had to invite individuals for dinner, who would you invite, and kind of get candid responses. But this, utilizing this resource through AAMC this particular year, I'm sure I speak on behalf of our admissions committee, we were definitely able to see more depth related to those responses and really how applicants respond when it comes to answering questions related to their experiences with others, working as part of a team. How did they respond when challenged on a particular project, and other types of questions like that. So I think that the inclusion of interviewing rubrics can really be helpful when ensuring that, once again, everyone has an opportunity to answer questions that are structured, that are intentional, that are thought of in advance, that really kind of take out kind of all the floweriness of the interviewing process, still allow individual to be themselves and be authentic, but it really gives everyone an opportunity to kind of, I think, equitably look at the interview responses in a way that's holistic, but also in alignment with what the program, once again, ultimate goals are and who you're looking to bring on into your programs. And then, of course, unconscious bias being another aspect of the interviewing process that's very important. As far as standard interview evaluations, this is a wonderful resource. If everyone is evaluating candidates using a rubric with the same expectations, you're more likely to get a stronger outcome that reflects the goals of your particular program. It's also important to ensure that the selection committee is diverse. Consider including individuals that maybe you haven't included before, whether that's faculty, residents, chief residents, diversity champions, et cetera. Take a look at who's looking at the applications, making the evaluations, and who determines who moves forward. And are those processes equitable? Next slide, please. So here's some additional holistic considerations. These are considerations we use at the UME level. Once again, lots of opportunities for overlap here with GME. and many things, you know, as far as that competency level with the AAMC's model. Of course, motivation for a career in medicine, that probably isn't something that's gonna, it's important, of course, but definitely important for us, for someone coming into medical school. There could be different considerations for someone going from medical school training into a residency program, but things that we appreciate. Everything, of course, on this list, but maturity, sincerity, ability to engage in conversation versus a prepared script. So when we interview, these are things that we're looking for. Is the individual comfortable in their own skin? Can they communicate clearly? Are they able to kind of show progression in their particular career or their experiences or their academics? Do they understand what they're getting themselves into related to the rigors of medicine? Or is there kind of an idealized view of what medicine is? And then what activities have they engaged in to show that they have leadership, commitment to service, and in particular the underserved, depending on various mission-based initiatives in our programs, as well as a cultural sensitivity and awareness, are things that potentially could be important to look for. Next slide, please. So considerations for candidate selection, of course, we've highlighted the importance of implicit bias training, also an opportunity to discuss program goals, mission-based recruitment efforts as part of the selection process, the utilization of evaluation rubrics, as I highlighted, the importance of having diversity amongst your selection committee and the process, engaging, once again, individuals who maybe you haven't considered before, and then also considering the use of a holistic review model, as we highlighted with the AAMC's EACM model. And then one additional thing that's been very helpful for us at the UME level when it comes to that needs assessment that we talked about at the very beginning of this part of the presentation, as well as the opportunity to set goals, program goals aligned with the institution's mission, is reach out to individuals who perhaps were ranked but didn't match, that maybe in particular were of your underrepresented in medicine candidates, and understand why they didn't choose your particular program. For us, this has been helpful in understanding individuals who we provided acceptance to, who did not ultimately choose UC Irvine. We want to know why. We look at that data every year to understand, you know, was it an issue related to location or scholarships or their experience on interview day. So all these little pieces of information can really help us ensure that as we look at data year to year, that we're making the necessary changes as part of our process. Next slide, please. And then, as Dr. Hernandez mentioned, there are some wonderful resources for unconscious and implicit bias. Understanding, once again, that we all bring that to the table, and it's important to understand how these experiences that we bring to the table can affect our behavior, interactions, and ultimately decision-making. And as decision-making thought leaders in these processes when it comes to admissions and selection, we have to be ultimately careful and committed to doing what we can, not only from an individual perspective, but also an organizational perspective. Next slide, please. And this highlights a wonderful resource through Marcelin et al. 2019 that talks about the impact that can happen when we talk about mitigating unconscious bias, not only at an individual and organizational level, but the importance of having both. So we individually have to do our part, but we also holistically have to work together as part of an organization to identify, you know, what needs to be done to get where we need to go. Next slide, please. Some wonderful resources that are available to UC Irvine employees to address implicit bias. We talked about training a lot during this section. So here are some great resources that you can utilize. One also through the AAMC, which takes about 15 minutes and is a wonderful Vimeo video on implicit bias and virtual interviews. Next slide, please. And these are just some references that you'll have as part of the presentation if you want to go back and refer to anything that was discussed. And I'm hoping that once again, this information will spark conversation about the importance of things that are being considered as part of the selection process for your future residents, faculty, and potentially staff. I know that it is intentional work and it does take continual effort, but if we all put our heads together and utilize resources that exist, stand on the shoulders of giants, and engage each other, this is definitely good work and work that can be done.